Father, we thank you for this opportunity that we have, that we can come together and talk about these topics which help to form our community, a place where we are trying to honor your name, to worship you, and to teach our children your ways. So, Father, I pray that you would bless this time. I pray that you would bring to my mind all of those things that I've been studying as I've been going through this particular topic. Help me to articulate these things in a way that's that everyone can understand and in a way that glorifies your name. So bless this time here today. B'Shem Yeshua we pray. Amen. You know, when we first started walking in the Torah, I remember being at the congregation, and after service, one of the first few times that we had started attending, this woman comes running up to us, and she's really excited, and she's telling Margaret and I as she's coming towards us, "You are Moranos. You guys are Moranos." Now, I'm not the most fluent in Spanish. In fact, my Spanish is not very good at all. I can probably order something from the Taco Bell menu, but other than that, my Spanish is not very, very good. But I do know some words, and she was calling us Marranos. She was saying, "You guys are pigs," from my understanding. And I thought, well, maybe since I don't know Spanish that well, maybe she's trying to say something else. And so in my mind, I'm quickly trying to determine, is there another word that might sound like that? And I couldn't think of anything, and I think it was pretty clear. She was calling us Marranos. She was calling us pigs. I had no idea what she meant. She had to explain to us what she was talking about, because I thought, why is she so happy about insulting us? Well, the thing is, back in the what they call the Spanish Inquisition, this happened in the early 1400s, maybe even into the late 1300s. But the Catholic Church was persecuting the Jews, actually all the non-Catholics there in Spain. And the people were being forced to convert to Catholicism, to abandon their religion, whatever religion they had, and to convert to Catholicism or be killed. And in many cases, not only after they converted, they were still killed. But because they converted, they said that they would actually go to heaven. So anyway, it was a very horrible time, and it lasted centuries, the Spanish Inquisition. And it came all the way into Mexico, which some have called the Mexican Inquisition. But around 1492, when Columbus left Spain, some believe that actually Columbus was Jewish, and he was one of these Jews that was exiled, one of these Jews that was kicked out of Spain. And some believe that everyone that left with Columbus was actually Jewish. And so these Jews, the area of Spain was known as Sepharad. It was known as, and this is a biblical location. You can find this I believe in Obadiah. You can find the mention of Sepharad. And this is actually modern-day Spain and the Spanish, the Iberian Peninsula. And so the Sephardic Jews come from this particular area. And so it was the Sephardic Jews that were expelled from Spain, and many of them went into the Muslim countries, the Middle Eastern countries, and some down into North Africa, some actually up into North Europe, and then with Columbus, some came down to the Americas. And so many of these Jews actually did convert to Catholicism. And there were various names that these Jews were given. One of them was Marranos, because they were forced to eat pig. They were forced to eat pork or swine in public. And so in doing this, they were proving that they had actually abandoned their Jewish culture, and they were now part of Catholicism, of the Catholic religion. And so they were spared their lives. Some of them were spared their lives. And so many of these people actually kept their Jewish identity, and they kept their Jewish traditions, and they continued to practice Judaism behind closed doors. But when they were out in public, they portrayed themselves as being Catholics. And many of these Jews, they passed on their Jewish traditions to their children, but they didn't tell their children that they were Jewish. And this went on for many generations. And this happened in Spain. This happened, like I say, in the Middle East, and it's happened a lot in the Americas, in South America, in Central America and Mexico, and even all the way up into New Mexico, some parts of Texas and Arizona, and even as far north as South Colorado. And so many of these Jews are coming, many of these people are coming to awareness of their Jewishness because of the traditions that they're finding that they've been doing, whether it's hiding a little Torah scroll or a little scroll of scripture text behind a picture of the Virgin Mary by their front door. Or maybe it's lighting candles on Friday nights, and or maybe it's the way that they sweep their house. They sweep everything to the middle of the room. Or I don't know. There's a lot of these traditions that are telltale signs of these people being actually of Jewish descent, but not knowing it. These are just traditions that they've been taught, that they've carried from generation to generation, but they didn't know that they were actually Jewish. And so now they've come out. Many of these people have now realized that they have these Jewish traditions and that they're actually Jewish. They trace their lineage, they trace their heritage, and they find out that they're actually from from Spain, and they're from these families who either were expelled from Spain, or people that escaped the persecution there in Spain and in Mexico. And so obviously a lot of these people are Hispanic, and they have Hispanic last names. And there's a list that you can find on the internet of a lot of names that came from these groups that fled. And so a lot of people say that if your name is on this list, it automatically means that you're Jewish. And so this is what this woman was talking about when she came running up to us and saying, hey, you guys are part of these Marranos, these crypto-Jews, these Sephardic Anusim. Anusim means those who have been coerced. So they are Sephardic Jews who have been coerced and forced to become Catholics. And so when we first heard this, when she told us this and we've learned about the Sephardic Anusim, it sounded intriguing, and it sounded interesting because they say that these Sephardic Anusim, they have a Jewish heart, and when they hear things about Torah, they're drawn to Torah, and it's easy for them to start walking in these traditions and walking in Torah, and to come out of Catholicism. And we fit that bill. I mean, the way that she described it, Margaret and I looked at each other and we thought, wow, this might be us. And so over the next few weeks, we considered our own past, we considered our own childhoods, and we considered the things that we had experienced as children. And I could not, for the life of me, remember any Jewish traditions that we kept as children. We had pictures of the Virgin Mary. In fact, I painted my grandmother a picture of the Virgin Mary. My grandmother used to light candles under the pictures and the crucifix that she had there in her house. And we did a lot of various Catholic traditions, but I don't remember doing any of these Jewish traditions that we've learned over the past 15 years. I don't remember doing these things as a child, and neither did Margaret. She didn't have any of these secret traditions either. And so I interrogated my parents and my grandmother to get more information out of them, and they have no recollection of any of these things. Nothing struck a chord with them, and so over the next few weeks after this woman telling us this, after we did our own research for ourselves, we've come to the conclusion that no, we're not Sephardic Anusim. Now, it's possible because the name Gonzales, which actually means son of Gonzalo, that this name is on the list, and you'd be surprised. I mean, pretty much every Hispanic last name is on this particular list, and so there may be back in our past somewhere some Jewish relative, but also, to me, in my opinion, just because the name is on the list, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are you're of Jewish descent. And so I've been, since this point and since my research on this, I've been kind of leery of this. I think it's a distraction. I think it's cool because I do know of one family in particular where they found out that they are Anusim, and there have been many, many families who have found out that they are actually Anusim. And then there's other people who they really like the idea, and so they contrive memories and they contrive a history that they say that actually they were Jewish and they have this Jewish background and so on and so forth, and that's The interesting thing for me is that because they've never mentioned it before until they hear about the Anusim idea, that now all of these memories start to come forward. So I really can't. I shouldn't judge their story, but at the same time, it's never come up before. And also, like I'm saying, I may have some kind of most of us may have some kind of Jewish ancestor in the past. But also, we might also have a French ancestor. So does that make us French? We also may have a pygmy ancestor. Does that make us pygmies? So again, the idea is, how were we raised? That's kind of how I look at my past. What was my family, and how was I raised? And so today this is what we're gonna look at. We're gonna talk about who is a Jew, and do we need to become Jews when we become followers of Yeshua? If we want to walk in Torah, do we need to become Jewish? And so we're going to go through the first chapter in Tim Hegg's teaching called An Introduction to Torah Living. Now, this is a whole series of teachings that you can get off of the Torah Resource website. It's torahresource.com. If you want to purchase this, it's a pretty good resource. I don't think that I'm going to go through every chapter of his teaching, but this, as I went through his stuff before, I thought this is a really good place for us to start. Those of us who are new to Torah, those of us who are now embracing Torah, and we want to start walking in this, and we're wondering, is it okay for us as non-Jews to do this? I think this is a good place for us to start and to get a good understanding. So today we're going to go through this first chapter. We're going to look at who is a Jew. We're going to talk about a couple of movements who kind of muddy the waters in regard to who is a Jew or an Israelite, or someone who is of Jewish ethnicity, someone who's a native born to Israel. And these two movements, one actually came from the other. The first one that came around, it was called the Christian Identity Movement. And the second one is the two-house or the Ephraimite movement. And I'll just say right off the bat that I do not subscribe to the two-house theology. It's my opinion that it's an errant theology. And like those of you who know me, you know that when I move into something, I go very, very slow. And I remember when, even after this woman told us that we were Sephardic Jews, and we went slow about that and researched that, and then decided that no, we're not Sephardic Jews, and nor are we going to tell people that we are. I remember our pastor back at the other community that we were at, he wrestled with this as well, and was trying to determine what should we call ourselves. And there was one particular teaching that he had that he was so bold as to say that we should tell people that we are Jews, as non-Jewish people, as Gentile believers who've been grafted into Israel. He was saying that it's okay to call yourself a Jew, and that if you were confronted by an Orthodox Jew or an actual Jewish person, that you could tell them that you were Ephraim, that you were of the tribe of Ephraim, and you're not being brought back. Well, looking back, this has some of this two-house kind of mentality to it, and I think he has changed his position on this. But this is what I was told early on, and I wrestled with that, and I wasn't sure exactly how to understand this. And so, since we started Front Range, we've really been going slow about this. Again, we consider ourselves a Messianic congregation. We don't call ourselves a Messianic Jewish congregation because we don't want anyone to think that we're trying to be Jews, even though a lot of the things we do look Jewish. But we want to be clear about this. But I do believe that the two-house theology, over the past 5 years that I've seriously been looking at it and asking people their opinions on it and getting different input from various people, I've come to the conclusion that it's errant. And actually, one cannot come to this conclusion of this two-house understanding by studying the Word using a proper biblical hermeneutic, or in other words, interpreting the Scriptures in the proper way. You can come to this conclusion by looking at it from skewed theology, from skewed perspective. And so, also, I want to make clear that it's not my goal to disparage, to make fun of, to embarrass, or to anger anyone as we go through this teaching. I have some close friends, some folks who are very dear to me, who follow this particular teaching. And so what I want to do is explain to you, I want to read this teaching from Tim, and I'm going to comment on it as we go through it. And if you have any questions, please let me know. And also, as we put this stuff out on our website, I will add this handout as well as other articles to support what it is that we're going through. Okay? So let's go to the top of page 3 here in our handout. Chapter 1, Who is a Jew? Why this question needs to be asked. The question of who is a Jew is an important question for at least several reasons. First, because living a life of Torah often looks very Jewish. And he said in the introduction to this particular class that the Jewish people have been the only people group to have been walking in Torah for generations, for a couple thousand years and more. Have the Jewish people been actually walking in Torah? They're the only ethnic people group to be doing this. And so that's why when we start walking in Torah, we adopt their traditions because they have already established these traditions. Okay, first because living a life of Torah often looks very Jewish, and as a result, some have come to the conclusion that if you live Torah, you become Jewish. And so I'm sure those of you who have already started walking in Torah and you've told your families that this is what you're going to start doing, you're going to start celebrating on Shabbat, you're going to start following the feast days, you're not going to eat pork anymore. And as you start saying these things, you're just saying these things from the Bible. You're saying, this is what the Bible says, this is what I'm doing. And usually one of the responses that you will hear is, why are you becoming Jewish? Why are you trying to act Jewish? If it hasn't happened to you yet, it's bound to happen. Let's continue. But this simply is not the case, any more than if you swim a lot, you become a fish. Being a Jew has both an ethnic side, which is being a descendant of Jacob, as well as a faith side, which is understanding your covenant with God. And so a Jewish identity is formed along these two lines, having a bloodline or a race or an ethnic connection with the genealogy of Jacob. And the second part is having a faith in God, understanding the covenant with God. You have a pursuit of God, and you are pursuing Him through His Word and through His Torah. So being a Jew is formed along those two lines, okay, ethnically and genealogically, having a faith. Continuing on. Everyone who has true faith in Messiah becomes a member of the covenant God made with Israel. This is what the Scriptures mean by being brought near and having Abraham as one's father. So in Ephesians 2 in verse 13, it says that we have been brought near. Those who have been far off have now been brought near. This is talking about us who are non-Jews, the Gentiles. We have now been brought near. This is covenant language. This is a language of worship talking about our God. We are now brought near. Remember, Kevin recently taught on the sacrifices, and he mentioned how that word korban, a reference to the sacrifice, it means to bring near. And so through the sacrifices, we can now come near to our God. And so that's what this also means. We have now been brought near. It's covenant language. Okay? But while all who believe take on covenant status, this does not change one's ethnicity. So Abraham is the father of many nations. And this is when God changes Abraham's name from Abram to Avraham, which means a father of many nations. And God gives Abraham this promise that through him, many nations of the earth, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And we see this particular aspect of the promise come into fruition through Yeshua. And we talked about this at Shavuot. When Yeshua ascended into heaven and he gave the Great Commission talks about his Jewish followers going out to the nations and making them disciples. And so up until this point, Yeshua was only there for the Jewish people. He was only there for his own brothers. But then when he left, he, in a sense, opens the floodgates to now allow the Gentiles to come in, and he instructs his disciples. He says, you Jewish guys, you now go out to the nations and make them disciples. And so this is where we see this promise that's been given to Abraham. We see it now coming into fruition through the promise of Yeshua. And so we see that connection in Shavuot. And in Romans 4 and verse 16, Paul talks about this promise is for all who believe. The promises of God are now for all who believe in Yeshua. And so when we adopt a Torah lifestyle, we don't become Jewish, but we've been grafted into God's people. We've been brought near. It says also in, I believe it's in Ephesians, that we are now, and I think even in Romans, that we are now part of the commonwealth of Israel. And it's interesting that this particular phrase would be used because it's not necessarily that you become one of them, but you're now part of the commonwealth. You now all of the rules and responsibilities of a citizen are now upon you because you've joined this nation, this group of people. So asking the question, who is a Jew, has important theological ramifications. Secondly, it is an important question because Judaism itself has made this inquiry throughout her history. Indeed, the rabbinic debate over what constitutes a Jew is still ongoing in Israel today. While the legalities of citizenship have been decided, the question is still an open one. How much Jewish blood does one have to claim to claim the status of a Jew? So this is a question that's not easy to answer, who is a Jew? It's a question that is still an ongoing debate. And it's interesting that I still see articles on this, even today, new articles with different rabbis and theologians and even government officials in Israel still bringing up this idea and still batting it around, trying to determine who is a Jew. Thirdly, it is important to ask this question because there continues to be a great deal of confusion in this area. With the rise of the Christian identity movement and the so-called Ephraimite or two-house movement, many people are confused about what constitutes Jewishness. So this is where we will start with a simple yet profound question, who is a Jew? Different answers have been given to the question by different groups of people coming from different viewpoints. We'll begin with the rabbis. For the sages, a great deal of emphasis is put upon physical lineage. For instance, notice the legal rulings of the Mishnah Kiddushim 3 and verse 2. Now, this tractate in the Mishnah talks about marriage and children and that sort of thing. In every case where there is a licit betrothal or a legal or a correct betrothal, and there befell no transgression, the status of the offspring follows that of the male. And so, when the betrothal and everything was correct and everything was normal, then the offspring followed that of the father. And then if we turn the page, top of page 4, it says, where there is valid betrothal but transgression occurred, the standing of the offspring follows that of the inferior party. And so wherever there was a non-valid betrothal, the lineage followed that of the mother. But in most normal cases, the lineage of the child was supposed to follow that of the father. And so that includes tribal identity, that includes inheritance and genealogy. It would follow the father. But if you consider if the mother was if her husband died, remember she was supposed to marry a kinsman redeemer, and in order to carry on the name of the father, well then instead of that child following the lineage of the new father or of the new husband, it would follow that of the old father or her first husband in order to carry on his name. And so those are the only cases there that we see where that was supposed to happen. But then later on, additions to the Mishnah, further on down the page, on page 4, it says, "Thy son by an Israelite woman is called thy son, but thy son by a heathen woman is not called thy son." And so this later addition to the Talmud, it's probably comes from this next passage that we see in Genesis 22 in verse 2. It seems reasonable that this conclusion of the rabbis might have been based on Genesis 22 and verse 2, where it says, "And he said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you." And so this obviously is the passage of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, where God tells Abraham, take your son and go and sacrifice to him. He says, take your son, your only son. Well, we know at this point, Abraham had two sons, right? He had Ishmael from Hagar, the Egyptian woman, and then he has Isaac by Sarah, his wife. And so what they say here is that God is the one that's saying that Isaac is your only son. Ishmael is not your son because she's from a heathen woman. She's from an Egyptian woman. And so this is where they get this understanding, and they make this change now to the rabbinic law, to the Jewish law, that this is what it means to have Jewish lineage. Since Abraham had already two sons, Ishmael by Hagar the Egyptian and Isaac by his wife Sarah, it is considered important that God identifies Isaac as your only son. From this, the rabbis deduced that Ishmael was not counted by God as Abraham's legal son. And since the only difference in the mother, both had Abraham as father, it follows that the status of the child follows the mother and not the father. Therefore, on the basis of this definition, a child born to a Jewish father and non-Jewish mother must convert to Judaism in order to be officially considered a Jew. And we find a lot of people, I've met a lot of people like this, who they say their father was Jewish and they have a Jewish last name, but their mother was not Jewish. And so therefore, in the eyes of the Jewish community, mainly the Orthodox, they would say, okay, you're not a Jew. And if you want to participate in our Jewish events and participate in our synagogue, you have to convert. You have to convert to Judaism because your mother was not a practicing Jew. Let's continue. This rabbinic definition was followed for centuries. However, in modern times, and particularly since the establishment of the State of Israel, the definition has been more and more questioned. As children of mixed marriages grow up in Israel, speak the language, identify with the spirit of Jewish culture, and serve in the Israeli Defense Forces, they feel discriminated against when they are not registered officially as Jews. So also we need to consider that in ancient times, the language was through the line of the father, like we just mentioned. But in today's society, you have to prove that not only that your mother was practicing Judaism, but that your grandmother was also a practicing Jew. And this is how the Orthodox view it. If you don't have those two generations proving that you were actually raised Jewish, then they don't consider you a Jew. And even in Israel, I think it's the rule is you have to have that proof in order to make aliyah, in order to return to Israel. And so people try to, those who might have a Jewish past, then you got to prove that you actually are a bona fide Jew in their eyes. There has been and continues to be a movement to define Jew in other than religious ways that are not based on the Torah. But this is vigorously opposed by the various religious parties. Under the law of return established by the State of Israel, any Jew has the right to settle in Israel as a citizen, if he or she wishes. The law forced the government to define Jew, and it did so on a very broad basis, rejecting the strict rabbinic definition and choosing rather to rule that a Jew was anyone who, in the normal course of society, was viewed as a Jew. The court also ruled at the same time that Jews who had converted to Christianity could not immigrate under the law of return. Therefore, while the court refused to accept the rabbinic definition per se, the issue of the religious practice was not entirely taken out of the working definition. And so we see that even when they created this law of return, the one exception that they had was Christians. Christians could not return, or those Jews who had become Christians could not return to Israel. They could not make aliyah. They could not become Israeli citizens. And also we see that when they created Israel, they just looked at a very loose definition of what it meant to be Jewish in order to return. They didn't have to have the lineage, or they didn't have to have the the practicing history in their family, as long as they weren't Christian. So they didn't totally do away with the religious aspect of it. You could be whatever, and that's the puzzling thing even today. You can be a Buddhist or a New Age Jew and make aliyah, but if you're a Christian Jew, you cannot make aliyah. In more recent court battles by Messianic Jews who desire to immigrate under the law of return, the Israeli court has upheld the earlier ruling that Jews who convert to Christianity no longer retain their status as a Jew. So even today, the Messianic Jews there in Israel find a hard time to gain respect and to be accepted into Israel. And so why would you think that this would happen, that these Christians, these Jews who believed in Jesus, could not become part of Israeli society? And this is probably a result of the Holocaust. Remember, Israel, the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel was established after the Holocaust, right? After World War II. And so after that happened, and their understanding of the Nazis and Hitler and what they stood for, the Jewish people saw that they were Christian, and that all that they did in the name of Jesus. And so this is probably a reaction to their understanding of the Nazis and what they stood for. And the theme of the Holocaust, of all of the Holocaust Remembrance Days, is never again, that they never want to allow this to happen again. And so one of the ways to prevent that from happening again, keep the Christians out. And so I don't know if that's exactly the reason why, but you can understand why this might be a reason why that they're not allowing the Christians in. Among the modern branches of Judaism, the Orthodox and Hasidic communities still maintain the rabbinic definition. The conservative, Reconstructionist, and Reformed are, in many cases, liberalizing their definition. In the recent past, the Reformed synagogues of America ruled that a child is Jewish if either of the parents is Jewish. And so this is what we find in these more liberal Jewish congregations, that they're allowing people whose mother was a non-Jew but their father was a Jew. They're allowing them to say that, yes, you are a Jew and you're welcome in and you're treated like the rest of the Jews. You're treated like a brother, basically. Is it possible that in the first century there were varying levels of status with regard to Jewishness? One whose mother and father were Jewish may have been considered more Jewish than someone born of Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother. Some consider this to account for the different terms Hellenists and Hebrews in Acts 6 and verse 1. Paul also appears to distinguish between Hebrews and Israelites in 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 22. So in Acts 1, remember, or in Acts 6 and verse 1, this is talking about the Jewish people that were complaining, and they said, hey, the Hellenistic Jews are not being treated fairly, and the Hebrew Jews, they're being treated fairly, so what's going on here? And so that's when the apostles, they said, you know what, we need to raise up some deacons, we need to raise up men to go and make sure everyone's taken care of. And so they raise up the leaders, and they go and they take care of the women of these the Hellenistic Jewish women and the Hebrew Jewish women, and make sure everyone was treated fairly. So we see that there were these distinctions between the groups. And then also, Paul also appears to distinguish between Hebrews and Israelites. And in 2 Corinthians verse 11, he talks about himself being if they're in Israel, if they're from Israel, I'm an Israelite, and they're Hebrew, I'm a Hebrew. And the idea behind this is he was identifying to a common identity. He was saying that, hey, I identify with all these different titles, whichever one you're using, we have a common identity. And this may be a hint, this isn't for sure, but it may be a hint of a possible varying definitions of Jewish identity even in the first century. Let's continue on. We're towards the bottom of page 5, religious association. Physical lineage is not the only aspect of being a Jew according to the rabbis. Though a place in the world to come is generally accredited to all Jews, those who deny the resurrection of the dead, the divine origin of the Torah, or who espouse Epicurean doctrine, who do not have a place in the Olam Haba, the world to come. And thus, while the rabbis put a great importance upon physical lineage, they also consider certain aspects of belief in God essential for one's Jewishness. I remember hearing a quote from a rabbi here in a teaching, and he basically said that one cannot be a Jew without having Torah. And so if you don't follow Torah, you're really not you're not a Jew, even if your mother and grandmother were indeed Jewish. This emphasis upon belief in God forms the foundation of proselytism in the rabbinic writings. So we have the physical lineage that we just talked about, and now this is the faith aspect of it. And so because you needed a belief in God in order to maintain your Jewishness, according to the rabbis. They come up with this idea that if you believe in God, then you can actually convert. If it's about faith, then you can actually convert. Someone can convert to Judaism. One who has no physical lineage to Jewish blood, therefore, may convert or proselytize into Judaism, and by this conversion, gain all the status of the bloodline Jew, at least in theory. So keep in mind that conversion is a rabbinic issue. There's nothing in the Scriptures about conversion. Nowhere in the Scriptures do we see a non-Jew gaining the status of a Jew. Nowhere in the Scriptures do we see that prescribed or even encouraged. In fact, it is discouraged by Paul. The convert agrees to the basic tenets of modern Judaism and to maintain the 613 laws found in the Torah based upon Exodus 12 and verse 49. There shall be one law for the citizen and for the stranger that dwells among you. By agreeing to this and undergoing a ritual of conversion or circumcision, which includes circumcision for the males, a mikveh or a water immersion, and offering a sacrifice, the proselyte obtains an equal status with the native Jew, provided by the fact that he may marry a Jewish woman, even the daughter of a priest. And so, while we do agree that there's only one law for the citizen and for the stranger, for everyone who believes in God, there's only one law, there's only one Torah. But we don't become a Jew, we don't convert, we're not transformed. The early rabbis, however, were divided on the issue of proselytes and whether they should be accepted without reservation. Some taught that proselytes should be treated with even more respect than the native born. Now, I've heard that some would say, "Hey, we were born this way, and so we were just born into this family." But someone who was born a non-Jew and they want to be a Jew, well, hey, we need to give them a little more respect because they're joining our group. They've decided on their own to join. And this particular rabbi, he says, he taught his students to mistrust proselytes until 24 generations had passed. Now, this doesn't mean, you're keeping track of 24 generations. It just means we need to be overly cautious of an individual when they convert because they may have some, their motivation may be a bad motivation. Because there were people that were motivated to become proselytes or to convert to Judaism because maybe they found security in the Jewish community. Maybe they saw how the Jewish people took care of the poor. They took care of the widows and the orphans. And so they say, you know what, I want to be a part of those people because they take care of each other. And so that's one of the reasons that they may have converted. Or maybe a non-Jewish guy falls in love with a Jewish girl and says, hey, you know what, I want to marry this girl. And they say, you can't unless you're Jewish. And so he wants to convert so he can marry her. So he does what he has to in order to get into a place where he can marry this individual. So that's another reason that people may have converted. And other people may have converted for other reasons, for other advantages, like even to engage in commerce or for business purposes. We actually see David and Solomon, with the multiple wives that they had, and most understand that they had these multiple wives. Part of it was to keep peace with other nations and that sort of thing. And so once they marry into the family, and then there's it's kind of a peace agreement. And so that was one of the reasons to marry into another culture. And the same way with the Jewish culture, people would marry in for business reasons. But there were some who actually had a heart for God. Some had a genuine heart for God, and those are the ones that they really wanted to respect. Okay, some taught that the proselytes should not say "God of our fathers" in the Amidah, while others disagreed. So in the prayer that we pray, when we get to the part where we say "Our God and the God of our fathers," some would say that, you know what, you're actually, even though you have converted, they're really not your fathers, and so you cannot say that. And the interesting thing, one of the analogies that I like to give is that when someone becomes a citizen of the United States, that they are able to say that all of the founding fathers of the country are now their founding fathers, and all of the history of the United States is now their history too. Likewise, when someone becomes part of Israel, that they're able to say that that the patriarchs are their fathers, and the history of Israel is now their history as well. But in regard to this conversion process, some taught that the proselytes could not say the God of our fathers because they weren't actually blood related. But we see Maimonides, the medieval sage, he says he accorded the proselyte with full status, for he writes in this from the letters to Obadiah, as every native Israelite prays and recites blessings, anyone who becomes a proselyte throughout the generations, and anyone who unifies the name of the Holy One, as it is written in the Torah, is a pupil of our father Abraham, and all of them are members of his household. Hence you may say, our God, and the God of our fathers. For Abraham, peace be upon him, is your father. For since you have entered beneath the wings of the divine presence and attached yourself to him, there is no difference between us and you. And that's interesting that he would say that. And actually, in Romans chapter 4, we see Paul bringing up the same idea, that now we are children of Abraham, and Abraham is the father of us all. And so we see Maimonides coming up with the same idea, that someone who converts to Judaism, Abraham is also their father. Also, it's interesting to note that Yeshua, in his teaching, in teaching us how to pray, he also says that we are supposed to pray, our Father. And you would have to think that he had in mind that the Gentiles at some point would join. And so the Gentiles would at some point say, our Father. Okay, so now let's look at near the bottom of page 6, the Messianic believers and the emerging Christian church. This is the late 1st century and early 2nd century. Very early in the life of the emerging Christian church, the issue of the relationship between those who accepted Yeshua as Messiah and those who had not became central. How should those Jews who have faithfully worshipped the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, yet who had not yet confessed Yeshua to be Messiah, how should these people be received? And so how should the believing community accept the non-believing community? How should they relate towards one another? The non-believing Jews, they weren't pagan. I mean, they followed the Torah. They just had not accepted Yeshua yet. And so you could, in a way, say that they were in process. They were in a process of having those blinders removed from their eyes to see Yeshua, to see who Yeshua was. He was and is Messiah. Various answers were given. Some felt that all needed to become Jews in order to have full status in the synagogue. So there were some believing Jews who felt that the non-Jews, the Gentiles, they had to become Jewish in order to be welcomed and have full status in the synagogue. And we see this in Acts 15. And also we see this in Galatians, where they talk about circumcision. And circumcision is a shorthand way of saying conversion. And so they were saying that the people had to convert to Judaism in order to be saved. That actually, they were not a member of the covenant if they had not also converted. And this is the problem that we find in the 1st century in regard to the Gentiles. Others felt that the era of the Jews was over and that Jewish believers should forsake the traditions and the forefathers and meld into the growing Gentile congregation. So as the Gentiles started to grow, or as the number of Gentiles started to grow in the early believing community, the Jews were outnumbered, and the Gentiles that had been grafted in, they had no appreciation for the heritage and traditions of the forefathers, and they probably saw a lot of the traditions and things that they did a burden. Still, others saw a viable place for the Jew and the non-Jew to retain their status, yet find unity in the person of Yeshua. As the Messianic congregations grew and became predominantly Gentile, and as the non-believing Jewish community became more and more adversarial in her view of Yeshua, it was inevitable that the two communities would grow apart. And so the split happened on both sides. As the Jewish community the Jewish side and the non-Jewish side, they both did their things to cause this split happen. The church came up with their theories and theologies that they replaced Israel, and the synagogue also persecuted the early church. I mean, look at what Paul did, and look at his history and the things that he did towards the believing community. Well, we can't think that he was the only one that persecuted them. The second Jewish revolt, known as the Bar Kokhba revolt, contributed to the final separation of the Messianic synagogues and the traditional synagogue. Simon, given the title Bar Kokhba, which means son of a star, by the leading rabbi of the time, Rabbi Akiva, led the revolt. So sure was Rabbi Akiva that Simon would lead to ultimate victory that he declared him Messiah, asking the Jewish community to likewise follow him as their Messiah. And so Rabbi Akiva, he really thought that Simon Bar Kokhba, that he was the Messiah, that he was Messiah ben David. He was going to lead them into victory as they had this revolt, and he called him the Messiah, and he wanted everyone there in Israel to believe this as well. Well, obviously, the followers of Yeshua could not make such a profession, and their subsequent unwillingness to rally behind Simon caused their exclusion from the wider Jewish community. Their expulsion from the larger Jewish community was heightened by the massacre which Simon and his followers underwent at the hand of the Roman armies. And so the Jewish communities resented and probably even blamed the Messianic communities because they didn't help them, because they didn't join their efforts in order to come against the Roman army, and they were defeated. And so this was the beginning of the split. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. So devastated was the Jewish community after the failed revolt, and so at odds with the followers of Yeshua, who failed to come to their aid at that critical time, the chasm between the two communities widened and deepened. While some believers in Yeshua continued to be part of the synagogue community, the vast majority left and formed their own synagogues and communities of faith in which non-Jews were the majority. The loss of Jewish traditions in connection with the larger Jewish community inevitably led to a redefinition of the community, a definition that disregarded the historical connection to the nation of Israel. And so this is where we see the split really happening, and even the believing Jews, they now left the synagogues of the non-believing Jews, and so we see this split, and they go into their own synagogues, and they now divide up into non-believing synagogues and believing synagogues. And in the believing synagogues, the ones that believed in Yeshua, that followed Yeshua, non-Jews were the majority. And like I said, a lot of these non-Jews, they didn't have an appreciation for the heritage and traditions of the forefathers. And so this is where we see a change in the traditions and the expression of worship in the believing community. This wasn't something that was supposed to take place, but this is just how it happened. As late as 400 CE, Jerome indicates that still some Jewish believers remained in the synagogue, but the very fact that he mentions it identifies the occurrence as out of the ordinary. So this particular historian, Jerome, he mentions that there are actually these believing Jews who do these Jewish practices, but they believe in Jesus, and so for them this was something that was out of the ordinary, and this was as late as 400 in the Common Era, in the Common Era, or 400 AD, and so this was out of the ordinary. But so then by this point, the majority of the believing communities worshipped in a way that was not Jewish. The vast majority of believers had left the synagogue around the middle of the 2nd century, and by the time of Justin Martyr, a new attitude prevailed in the church, evidenced by its appropriating the title Israel for itself. And so this is where we see by 160 CE of the Common Era, 160 AD, this is where we see replacement theology taking place. The seeds of replacement theology were being sown, and this is where it begins. This is also known as supersessionism. But the interesting thing for us to consider is that in Jeremiah 31 and verse 33, this passage which we get the words the new covenant, this is the passage of the new covenant. It said that this covenant is made with Israel. And so in order for the new covenant to include the non-Jews, or the believing community that has now abandoned their Jewish heritage, in order for them to say that the new covenant applies to them, well, they have to call themselves Israel. And so this is how they come up with this replacement. They say, you know what? When it talks about Israel now, it's talking about us, this new formation, the believing community. We're not Jewish. God has forsaken them. We are now Israel. The church had come to believe that the Jewish defeat in the second Jewish revolt was in fact the judging hand of God, indicating that he had rejected the physical nation and had rather turned his heart toward the non-physical spiritual entity of the church. Thus was born replacement theology, the notion that God has forsaken physical ethnic Israel and replaced her with the church, a nation which made of all those who had confessed Yeshua as Messiah. As Marvin Wilson writes, Marvin Wilson in his book Our Father Abraham, he says that until this time, which he's talking about the Bar Kokhba revolt, the early 2nd century, until this time, the church had defined itself more in terms of continuity with the Jewish people. That is, it was an extension of Israel. There was a growing awareness, however, that the synagogue was firm in its stance that Jesus was not the Messiah of Israel, and that on this point, the synagogue was not going to change its mind. The realization of this impasse gradually drew the church to define itself in terms of discontinuity with, indeed, the replacement of Israel. The idea that the church has replaced physical Israel is held by a large segment of the Christian church today. And you'll find that. You'll find that even today, even though there seems to be a movement in Christianity to support Israel, to pray for Israel, and there's Israel Awareness Days, and there's all these efforts to pray for Israel and to have some kind of alliance with Israel. There's an underlying theology there. There's an underlying belief there that actually the church has replaced Israel, and you can't get past that. It's obvious, and the more you talk to pastors and even just Christians in general, I think you will find that if you haven't already. The question then of Jewish identity remains somewhat moot for many Christians who believe that God has forsaken disobedient Israel. The question then of Jewish identity remains somewhat moot for many Christians who believe that God has forsaken disobedient Israel and is therefore only interested in those who have received Christ as their Savior. For many of these, the modern state of Israel and the plight of the Jew has no greater relevance than the plight of people everywhere and the rise and fall of nations generally. And so this is I've come across people like this. They see Israel as just another country. They're just another group of people that they really have no special place in the eye of God. And this is why when we identify with Israel and we start to do these things that look and seem Jewish, some people get offended. And they say, why are you trying to be Jewish? Why are you trying to do these Jewish things? Can't you see that the church has replaced Israel? All that stuff is gone. That's under the law. That's dead. And so there's this negative outlook on the Jews, on the Jewish people and Jewish traditions. And when we try to return to that or practice these things, people really get offended by this. Because again, there's this underlying theology that remains even today, that the Jewish people are no longer Israel, that the Christian church is now Israel. Okay, now let's look at a couple of these movements that have somewhat blurred the lines of Jew and non-Jew. This first one is called the Christian Identity Movement. And I'll be honest with you, I've never heard about this particular movement, nor have I ever talked to anyone who has been a part of this movement. I've never met anyone. Well, maybe if I did, I didn't know they were part of this. But this is evidently something that has been going on and probably still is going on right now. Some would fall under this theology. But we can see how the next one that we'll talk about, the Ephraimite or the two-house theology, seems to come out of this particular teaching. The Christian identity movement is a rather recent resurgence of the older British Israelitism with an added anti-Semitic twist. And so if you want to do research on this, British Israelitism is a teaching by a fellow named Herbert Armstrong. You can do research on this and kind of read his theology and how, and what it's all about. But that's what evidently this Christian identity movement is, a resurgence of this old British Israelitism. British Israelitism was popularized in former years by Herbert W. Armstrong of the Worldwide Church. Other splinter groups of the Seventh-day Adventists, the Davidian wing, as well as other various fringe groups. While at first the Christian identity movement may appear to be just another replacement theology group, they differ in some notable ways. First, the Christian identity movement holds that the northern tribes of Israel taken into captivity by Syria were lost. By this they mean that they were not lost. By this they mean that they not only lost their identity as Jews to the communities around them, but they also lost their own identity, no longer remembering their connection to the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And so this idea of the lost tribes is an idea that we find in the two-house theology. We'll talk about that more here in a minute. Secondly, these lost tribes migrated through the Caucasus Mountains and settled in the regions of modern-day Germany, Ireland, France, and England. They were labeled as Caucasians because of the time they spent in the mountainous region of Europe. The Reformation and the revival which occurred in Europe that found its way to America via the Puritans is considered by the Christian identity movement to be the fulfillment of God's promise to bless Israel. Thus, for the Christian identity movement, the Anglo-Saxon Germanic peoples are the true Israel, or the 10 northern tribes, and those who call themselves Jews are therefore impostors. What is more, the modern-day Jew is being used by Satan to cloud or overshadow the truth that God has brought his people Israel, as he promised, to the promised land of America, and given her a strength and dignity unmatched in human history. Thus, the Christian identity movement is very patriotic, pro-America, and U.S. Constitution. They are blatantly anti-Israel, anti-Jew, and thoroughly anti-Semitic. So what can we say about this line of thinking? First, one of the foundational claims of the Christian identity movement is that the term Jew literally means one from the tribe of Judah, and not, as it is usually considered, a person with lineage to Abraham. It is true that the term Jew originally referred to someone from the tribe of Judah. We find that in Nehemiah 1, verse 12, or verse 2, Jeremiah 32, verse 12, and Jeremiah 40 and verse 11. But because the tribe of Judah remained for nearly 150 years after the northern tribes were taken into captivity, the term Jew became broader to include the post-exilic people of Israel in general, in contrast to Gentiles. And there's passages there in the handout to give you those examples. In the apostolic writings, or the New Testament, the term Jew is used in contrast to Gentiles, to Samaritans, and to proselytes. This would indicate that Jew in the apostolic writings is applied to one who is Jewish by both nationality and religion. And so we're going to find that in the text. And this is why I have always said we have to understand the context of the scriptures that we're reading. You're going to find the word Jew. You're going to find Israel. You're going to find Israeli. You won't find Israeli in the scriptures, but you're going to hear people use that term. Or even Israelites and Hebrew. And so what do all these terms mean? And so a lot of people give different definitions on these terms, and some people like to say that the word Jew means the same thing throughout all Scripture. We have to look at the context. We have to look at the context of the passage and to determine what they mean by that. In the particular passage, what do they mean by Jew? What do they mean by Israel? What do they mean by Israelite? Today, the term Jew or Jewish is universally understood to mean a person who traces his or her ancestry to the families of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For example, the American Heritage Dictionary gives as the first two entries under the term Jew an adherent to Judaism as a religion or culture, and number two, a member of the widely dispersed people originally descended from the ancient Hebrews and sharing an ethnic heritage based on Judaism. Secondly, and most important, the notion that the northern tribes were lost after being taken captive to Assyria is simply not historically or biblically accurate. So the 10 tribes are not lost. The 10 tribes, this is an idea, this is a theory that some people have, but biblically it's not accurate. Assyria was taken captive by Babylon in 625 BCE, a captivity that assimilated the Assyrian population into Babylon. It is altogether likely that the Israelites taken captive along with the Assyrians were likewise mixed into the Babylonian population. The subsequent exile of Judah in 554 BCE to Babylon means that those brought from Assyria and those from the land of Israel were now together in Babylon. That they should have found some refuge together, being of the same language and religion, seems inescapable. So in other words, when the Assyrian population was mixed into the Babylonian population, when they were assimilated in, that the Jewish people more than likely found each other because they had the same language, same beliefs. And so once again, Judah is brought together with Ephraim. The house of Israel and the house of Judah are brought together in the exile. But there is further evidence that the above scenario is accurate. Ezekiel was the prophet of the exile and would most certainly have known the component elements of the exiled Jewish community. Ezekiel 37, 15 through 28, this is the passage about the two sticks of Ephraim in Judah, definitely points to the fact where the prophet takes two sticks, one symbolic of Judah and the children of Israel, his companions, and the other of Joseph, the wood of Ephraim, and for all the house of Israel, his companions. Ephraim, being the largest of the northern tribes, is often used as a metonym for all of the northern kingdom. Here, then, Ezekiel identifies both the southern and northern kingdom to be together in the Babylonian exile. And so, while there may be some kind of future fulfillment of this particular passage, we see that it is actually the prevailing understanding of this passage is that the two sticks, Ephraim and Judah, the house of Ephraim and the house of Judah, comes together in Babylon. And so what are we to gather from this? Well, what is the understanding that we can take away from the two sticks coming together, the two houses coming together in Babylon? Well, the idea is that even in the midst of the worst, most possible scenario, even in the midst of the worst trial of them being exiled out of the land and in a sense rejected by God, that God still brings them back together in this worst possible scenario, and he is still looking out for his people by bringing them together, and eventually he will bring them back. Continuing on top of page 10. Likewise, Jeremiah speaks of the house of Israel and the house of Judah, leading us naturally to the inference that at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem and the deportation of the Judeans to Babylonia, Ephraim, the house of Israel, must have been a separate entity in the Assyrio-Babylonian Empire. Zechariah also recognizes the existence of the house of Israel as a separate entity which he sees as the object of God's future blessing. How could these prophets have identified the house of Israel if, as the Christian identity movement contended, their identity had been lost and forgotten? So their identity wasn't forgotten. The prophets actually saw them and understood them. The same evidence for the ongoing existence and identity of the northern tribes after the exile may be found in rabbinic sources. Sages of the 4th century CE speak of the deported Israelites being distributed in three directions. Medieval commentators such as Rashi and Kimchi both interpret Ezekiel 37 as referring to the northern tribes, entities which they recognize in their day. It is therefore entirely without warrant to assert that the northern tribes lost their identity and forgot who they were, only to be reminded centuries later when they become the recipients of the faith through the revivals of the Reformation. No more could they have walked away from the Babylonian takeover of Assyria than fly. And as gathered together in Babylon with the exiles from Judah and Benjamin, the whole was once again reunited in Babylon, returning after the exile under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah. That so few returned and that some wanted to remain in Babylon is surely the case. But a representation of the tribes, no doubt, returned and took up residence in the land. And actually, I have an article that kind of talks about this a little bit more and even shows the passages in Scripture where even after this time, after they've returned to the land, how a remnant of each of the tribes was there in Israel. To postulate otherwise is mere speculation. Unfortunately, the Christian identity movement has a strong anti-Israelism and anti-Semitism ingrained in its theology and is a real danger to those who are easily persuaded into their false teachings. So again, I've never heard of the Christian identity movement, but it's obviously a very dangerous movement or theology to take on and to follow. It is a form of replacement theology, and this idea of lost tribes is, in my opinion, a distraction. It's a legend, and it's a theory that's not biblically based. Let's continue on. The Ephraimite or the two-house movement. Now, keep in mind, the Christian identity movement, it's a fringe movement. It's something that, like I said, I've never encountered it, and if I have, I didn't know. But the two-house movement is more common among Messianics, and it's actually growing. And for those who were here last Shabbat, we actually had a couple of guys who came and joined us, and unfortunately, they slipped through my interrogation process, and actually, I kind of get the feeling that they weren't forthright with me when I asked them some questions about their belief, but they're very two-house, very two-house, and I briefly talked to them about their beliefs, and it was quite alarming how much they really how they're sold into this theology, which is an errant theology, and the worst thing about it is that they have now moved into a place where they have denied the deity of Yeshua. They don't believe that Yeshua is God, and that's alarming. That is very, very alarming. But again, it's not my desire to disparage two-house folks. I know that some folks in the two-house movement, they have a true heart for God, and they are genuinely looking for the truth, and they are genuinely trying to follow the Word of God. And actually, we have some who follow this particular teaching in our community. I have some dear friends who follow this teaching. But there are some in this movement who are on the fringe, and the teaching can be dangerous, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But the one thing that I find interesting about the two-house movement is that not everyone has the same views. There's not, and this is, you find the same thing in all denominations. Not everyone has the same understanding. But the problem with the two-house theory or teaching is that they're really it varies so much. It varies so much that I have found there's differences even in families. Even the husband and the wife will have a whole different view of what two-house means to them. And so there's no real, while there's some books written about it, there's no one way to define the two-house theology. So let's continue reading. I'm on the bottom of page 10. The Ephraimite or two-house movement. A recent movement in the whole world of Torah obedience is called Ephraimite or two-house movement. This errant theology gets its name from the house of Judah and the house of Israel terminology found in the Tanakh. And again, we find this terminology in Jeremiah 31 and verse 31. Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Top of page 11. Since Ephraim is used, particularly in the prophet Isaiah, as a designation for Israel, the northern 10 tribes, this label is substituted for the title Israel. And these are the basic tenets of the movement. And again, not everyone follows these tenets that are in the two-house movement, but these are the basic tenets for those who have been following this thinking for a long time. Number one, the northern tribes of Israel were taken into captivity by Assyria usual date is given as 722 BCE, and dispersed among the peoples of modern-day Iran and Iraq. And so this is where the two-house movement is very similar to the Christian identity movement, because they really rely heavily on this 10 lost tribe theory, this 10 lost tribe idea. And one of the things that they will mention also is that in Matthew 15 and verse 24, when Yeshua says that he was sent to the lost tribes of the lost sheep of Israel, they'll look at that passage and they say, you see, he is sent to the 10 lost tribes. Yeshua is right there is referencing the 10 lost tribes. But then if you jump ahead to James, the epistle of James, chapter 1 and verse 1, James, he addresses his epistle to the 12 tribes who are abroad. And so James obviously knows where all the 12 tribes are at. So he knows where the lost 10 are, and he's actually writing to them. And so it's just kind of interesting to consider that if you really believe this 10 lost tribe thing, that in James they're found. Why are we looking for some lost tribes if in James he says they're found? So by the time that Yeshua is looking for them, by the time we get to James, they're found. So anyway, let's continue on. We're at number 2 on top of page 11. Eventually, the descendants of these tribes of Israel, they forgot their heritage and became one and the same with the pagan nations among whom they lived. So Israel has lost their identity. These 10 lost tribes, according to the two-house theology, they have lost their identity as Israel. Number 3, it was God's faithfulness that brought the gospel to Europe, and particularly the Caucasus Mountain region, where it is said the descendants of Israel were primarily living. So unbeknownst to themselves, the descendants of Israel, they hear the gospel. Even though they don't realize, they don't even know that they have any blood connection to the people of Israel. But now the gospel comes to them. Number 4, in time, these Caucasians, they traveled to America as pilgrims, where they founded the New World. They still had no idea that they were descended from Israel, since they had lost their identity. And then number 5, as Torah obedience has been reintroduced to the church, many have found themselves naturally drawn to it, but cannot give a good reason why. Number 6, the Ephraimite movement gives an answer to the seemingly natural draw to Torah. The heart of an Israelite beats, yet hidden in the soul of a Torah-obedient Christian. And so this is the case for some folks who they start walking in Torah and they say, man, my heart beats so much for the Torah. I'm just drawn to the Torah. I'm just drawn to these Jewish traditions. I'm just drawn to this Jewish way of studying the Bible and this sort of thing. And so they say, well, this is the answer, because you are actually one of the lost tribes. You don't know it, but your descendants are actually from Israel. Number 7, thus those who have begun to pursue Torah have declared themselves descendants of the lost tribes of Israel as the restored house of Ephraim. And why else would you follow Torah? This is the thinking that people have. Why else would I follow Torah? It's because I'm actually an Israelite. It's because I actually have a Jewish heritage or an Israelite heritage. And so I am actually drawn to Israel. I'm one of the lost tribes. And in these movements, or in this two-house movement, there's a couple of different ways that they believe that God will reveal to you which tribe that you're from. One of the ways is through dreams or visions, that God will give you a dream, or he'll give you a vision, he'll give you some kind of sign that reveals to you which particular tribe that you are in. I've heard of a two-house conference that an individual went to, and he described how they identified which tribe that they were in, because they put up banners in the conference room of the tribes, and they told everyone, okay, everyone get up and go stand under the banner of the tribe that you are from. And everyone gets up and they go and walk towards, they go and stand under these banners. And so this individual that went to the conference, well, he asked one of the people there and said, how do you know which tribe that you're from? And this particular individual says, well, it's because of my talents. because I work with metal or wood, I forget what's the example that he gave, but because I have these particular skills, this means that I'm in this tribe because this particular tribe did these particular things, and so that's how we know that I'm from this particular tribe. And so, again, like I said, because there's a variety of ways of understanding the two-house theology, this is one of the ways, or a couple of the ways that they identify which tribe that they are a part of. Number 8. This movement makes a clear distinction between Jew, which denotes those people from the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, the southern tribes, and Israel, the 10 northern tribes. And so you'll hear that among two-house folks. They'll refer to rabbinic Jews today as Judah or brother Judah, or they're the Jews. And so all rabbinic Jews that are alive today on the earth, they believe come from the tribe of Judah, and that everyone else is from the tribe of Israel or the 10 northern tribes. I'm sorry, the Jews, they could be from Judah or Benjamin, and then everyone else is from the 10 northern tribes. Number 9, currently, the Jews want nothing to do with Ephraim. So in other words, the rabbinic Jews today, they want nothing to do with the believing Israel. Believers in Ephraim are the believers in Yeshua pursuing Torah. But there will come a time when the two sticks, the stick of Ephraim and the stick of Judah, will be united once again. The Ephraimite movement believes will happen when Judah comes to faith in Messiah. And so this is one of the main tenets of this is one of the things that I find consistent for the most part with two-house theology, is that when Yeshua returns and when the Jewish people believe in Yeshua and they accept Yeshua as Messiah, that is a picture of Ephraim and Judah coming together, which what we've already looked at. That's not biblically accurate. It's not biblically accurate because the Ephraim is not the Christian church. Ephraim is not the believers in Yeshua. Number 10. Thus, those in this movement, though they have no evidence at all of actual lineage to Jacob, call themselves Israelites and consider themselves to be the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Now again, there's shades of understanding in this, but there's a growing number of groups and communities. They continue to grow in this theology. I think it's probably because of the internet, and it's easy to get a hold of these teachings. But this is why I think it's important for us to have a proper hermeneutic. It's important for us to have a proper understanding of how to study the Bible. What's the right way to study the Bible, and not just through some guessing and not understanding the Hebrew. And that's why it's important for us to at least have teachers in our community that can work in the Hebrew, that can work in the Greek, and that have a good understanding of the Word, and that can teach the Word accurately and correctly, and not in a way that's going to undermine what the Scriptures are truly trying to teach. The Ephraimite movement, continuing on, bottom of page 11, the Ephraimite movement is primarily headed by Angus and Bacha Wooten, who founded the Messianic International Alliance and has authored several books outlining their doctrines. Moses Kochanowski, I think I butchered his name. He's the founder of the Union of Two-House Messianic Congregations, was originally with the Wootens in the MIA, but has subsequently split off, forming his own group. He has the necessity of pronouncing the sacred name as part of the doctrinal characteristics of his group. Other than that, and a few other things, he also holds a two-house theory of Israel and Judah. So again, there are shades of this two-house theology. There are different understandings, and with this particular group, he's added the sacred name nonsense of having to say the name a certain way, which is unfortunate. Again, that's just another rabbit trail. It's just another thing to get us off, another distraction, in my opinion, to get us away from what the Word is truly trying to teach us. The obvious problem with this theory is that it finds no basis in Scripture. Nowhere nowhere do the scriptures indicate that Israel, after being taken captive, forgot who she was or lost her identity. Again, not looking at it properly, not looking at the scriptures properly. Maybe through some kind of spiritual gymnastics, jumping here and there through scriptures, we can come up with this, finding a basis for this theory. And in fact, I've had a couple of people describe the two-house theory to me, to describe their understanding of this two-house teaching to me, and that's what it seemed to be, are scriptures lined up in order to tell a story, and that, again, that is not proper biblical hermeneutics. And so it says here, number one, nowhere do the scriptures indicate that Israel has been taken captive or forgot who she was or lost her identity. Those passages that speak of Israel's not knowing her master do not teach that she lost her memory, but that she was acting unfaithfully. For example, Hosea 2 and verse 3 and Hosea 5 and verse 3. These are a couple of passages that the two-house folks will say that are examples that Israel forgot who she was. Let's look at Hosea chapter 2 and verse 8. For she does not know that it was I who gave her the grain and the new wine and the oil, and lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. So it says she does not know that it was I. So here she didn't know. I guess she forgot in their understanding. And now Hosea 5 and verse 3. I know Ephraim and Israel is not hidden from me. For now, O Ephraim, you have played the harlot. Israel has defiled itself. Their deeds will not allow them to return to their God, for a spirit of harlotry is within them, and they do not know the Lord. So again, here's the idea that Israel, that they do not know the Lord, does not mean that they do not know about the Lord, but that they do not know the Lord in the sense of marriage or covenant between husband, Lord, and wife, Israel. And remember, we've talked about this before, that to know the Lord is a description of it's marriage language. It's an intimate relationship. And even in Jeremiah, where it says in Jeremiah 31, where it says, "No longer will we say know the Lord." The idea is of obedience. To know the Lord is to be obedient to the Lord. It's to be faithful to the Lord. They did not know the Lord, but they knew other gods. In other words, they were unfaithful to the Lord. They knew other gods, and they followed other gods. Back to bottom of page 12. There are clear indications that Israel does indeed remember who she is and who the Lord is, even when she is dispersed among the nations and forsaken the way of the Lord. Hosea 2 and verse 7. And she will pursue her lovers, but she will not overtake them. And she will seek them, but not find them. Then she will say, I will go back to my first husband, for it was better for me then than now. Israel, after trusting in foreign powers rather than God, is double-crossed and forsaken by the nations. In this context, she thinks of her first husband, who is Adonai, with the thought of returning to him. Far from forgetting who she is and who the Lord is, she remembers and knows what she ought to do. So she did not forget her first husband. She did not forget who she was, or she did not forget what she was supposed to do. She was just being disobedient, and she was doing the wrong thing. And so now she knows that she had to return to her first husband. She had to do the right thing. Number 2, at the bottom of page 12. The use of Jew to mean of the tribes of Judah or Benjamin, while being technically correct, is not the way the words are used in the time of Yeshua and the apostles. For instance, in Romans 11 and verse 1, Paul identifies himself as an Israelite, though he was from the tribe of Benjamin, and thus would be called a Jew according to the 2S people. Of course, Paul calls himself a Jew as well in Galatians 2:15. Thus, the scriptures do not make a clear distinction between Jew and Israelite, which this theory demands. So, again, the idea of this teaching, it's my understanding the origins of this two-house teaching is that early on in the Messianic communities, when there were Messianic Jewish congregations, And the leaders of these Messianic Jewish congregations were Jewish, and they would not allow the Gentile believers to participate. They wouldn't allow them to participate in the way that the Jewish believers would. And so the Gentile believers got upset, and they embraced this theology. They developed this theology, and they came up with this understanding. So now they can say, you know what? I'm part of you. You can't deny me, because now I'm one of you. I want the whole thing. And in fact, those visitors that came the other day, that's what he told me. He says he likes to go to these the Chabad houses in the area. He goes and he'll talk to the rabbinic Jews, and he'll tell them, you know, I'm Ephraim. I'm in. I get the whole thing. I'm not a Gentile. I'm blood just like you are. And so the origins of this movement and this understanding is all in a desire to be Jewish, or it's based in a desire to have Jewish lineage, and it's a sad thing to consider that, to think that this theory was put together in order to overcome a problem that should have never been a problem in the first place, because we find throughout the Word that Gentiles were supposed to be treated a certain way and welcomed in and supposed to follow the Torah. We find that all throughout in the Torah and in the Tanakh. And then we see how Yeshua instructs his disciples to go out to the Gentile nations. No, they were not lost tribes of Israel. They were not lost blood lineage to Jacob. They were Gentile nations. They were nations that were non-Jewish, non-Israelite, non-Hebrew, and they were supposed to be brought in to Israel. Also, another thing that I find in talking to some two-house folks is they don't like to be called Gentile believers. A lot of these folks will believe that the word Gentile always means pagan and heathen. It's always a negative word. Well, that's not the case. Again, when we look at the scriptures, we have to see what's the context of the passage. Sometimes it just means the nations in general. Other times, yes, it will mean pagans and heathens, but other times it's neutral, and sometimes it's even referred to as Israel. We find that in the Torah that Israel is called a Goyim HaKodesh, a holy nation. So anyway, again, we have to look at the context whenever we look at these words, and we can't just say that the word has just one meaning and that's what it means, especially with the word Gentile and the word Jew in the whole Bible. We have to look at the context of what is being said. Continuing on near the top of page 13. Furthermore, throughout the apostolic scriptures, Jew is regularly set against Greek or Gentile as describing the entire people descended from Jacob, not just one or two tribes. Number 3, one of the greatest flaws of this movement is that it calls into question the faithfulness of God. The Abrahamic covenant promises that blessings will come to the nations, and in this context, the word nations refers to those who are other than Israel, that is, who have no direct physical descendancy from Jacob. Yet in the two-house theory, those who are believers and think they are Gentiles are actually Israelites. Again, if you believe in Yeshua, if you're drawn to the Torah, well then, hey, you're actually an Israelite. You're not of the nations. And so, according to the two-house theory, everyone that's brought in is Israel. And so the nations aren't part of God's people. Continuing on. Thus the blessings are only upon the 12 tribes, and not upon the nations as God promises. Yet the promises of God in the Abrahamic covenant is that in your seed, all the nations or the families of the earth will be blessed. If everyone who comes to faith in Messiah is either of Judah and Benjamin or the 10 northern tribes, then in what way are the nations being blessed? Moreover, the picture given to us in Zechariah 8 and verse 23 is of 10 Gentiles taking hold of the fringes of a Jew, seeking to know his God. This is a 10-to-1 ratio and may indicate that the blessings of the nations in the last days will consist in greater number of Gentiles following God and his Torah than there are physical descendants of Jacob. So again, if everyone who becomes a follower of Yeshua is actually of Israelite lineage, then when God tells Abraham that he's going to bless the nations of the earth, God's not being honest. because he's really not blessing the nations of the earth. He's only blessing Israelites. And even Paul, speaking of the inspired word of God, he says in Romans 3 in verse 29, he says, is God not the God of the Gentiles also? And he says, yes, of the Gentiles also. So the point is this: God is the God of the Jews and the Gentiles, and they're all supposed to come together as one new man serving him. Now, the attitude that I've seen in some two-house folks is that the Jews are no better than me. And again, this is that it's not. I think it can turn into anti-Semitism, but it's not anti-Semitism. But it's a people want everything to be equal. Why are they chosen? I want to be chosen too. They're no better than me. I'm grafted in too. I'm just like one of them. And so we have this idea that we think that the Jews are better off than us, and so we want to be a Jew. And so therefore we go and we shake our family tree hoping a Jew will fall out, or we try and find some kind of Jewish traditions in our past that maybe we really are Jewish, because it's difficult for folks to say that I'm not Jewish, but I'm doing these Jewish things. I'm following Torah. I'm observing Shabbat. I'm not eating pork. And so that's the troublesome part. In actuality, the desire is to be a Jew, to have Jewish lineage, rather than just to follow God and to be obedient to His word. And in fact, I was told by one individual that if all the rabbinic Jews were erased off of the earth today, if they were all gone, it wouldn't matter, because now we are Israel. And that's a very scary comment. That's a comment, again, that can lead towards anti-Semitism. And it's obviously a replacement theology type of comment. So again, this is where it can get dangerous and it can get scary with two-house theology. Now again, it's not my desire to disparage anyone that follows this particular teaching, but I would encourage anyone listening to this who may subscribe to this two-house theology to come and talk to me. I want to hear your thoughts on why you believe this two-house theory, and like I've said before, and hopefully I continue to be slow to adopt any kind of teachings. And this is one teaching that I'm glad that I've been very slow and very hesitant, because I want to get an understanding of what it means and what direction it leads to. And honestly, I haven't seen very good fruit come from this direction. And I just want to hear other people's perspectives, and I want to challenge you to consider what I said. And I can point you to other resources that you can wrestle with as you consider your belief in this two-house theory. Bottom of page 13, the Scriptures. It is self-serving to claim that the Scriptures give us a clear and singular definition of who is a Jew, and in fact, I do not make this claim. However, believing the Scriptures to be inspired by God and believing that ultimately a correct understanding of the Scriptures will lead us to the proper definition, I want to look at some crucial texts for our subject. First, we should note that God speaks of Abraham's physical descendants when he gives the covenant promises. This is in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, I will make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all of the families of the earth shall be blessed." The same language is found in Genesis 15, 18 through 21, and 17, 6 through 8. And though, as we shall see, the fact that seed is everywhere found in the singular, and thus can be understood as a specific person in the offspring of Abraham, the word is correctly translated descendants, meaning the physical offspring of Abraham. Thus, in its initial setting, the historical grammatical interpretation of the covenant blessings show that they came upon Abraham's descendants, i.e. those who are related to him through lineage. Yet Romans 9:6 shows us the physical lineage from Abraham is not sufficient in and of itself to constitute someone as a Jew. And this says, "But it is not as though the word of God has failed, for they are not all Israel who are descended from Israel." Paul's argument here is that the disobedience of the nations as a whole, of the nation as a whole, does not mean that God has failed to keep his covenant promises. But his first point is that not everyone who has physical lineage to Abraham necessarily constitutes Israel. In the following context, he brings up Ishmael and Esau as two prime examples of those who have Abraham as their progenitor, but who are not, in fact, part of Israel. So in this Romans 9 passage, Paul is not saying that the physical connection to Jacob is of no importance. He's not saying that it's not a big deal to be a Jew. I mean, what he's saying is there's more to a covenant relationship with God than physical lineage. And we see how people would actually be cut off, and we've seen that in the Talmudic writings, that people would actually be cut off from being a Jew if they were disobedient to the Torah, if they were disobedient to God. But Paul is not saying that the physical connection is not important. And in fact, in Romans 3, he talks about the advantage of actually being a Jew. So Paul is not ashamed of his Jewishness, and he actually talks about it, especially in Romans 3. That's an excellent example to go through. So let's continue on. Earlier in Romans, Paul teaches that one who is truly a Jew not only has a physical connection to Abraham, but also participates in the faith that characterized Abraham. That is, there is not only a physical circumcision, but also the circumcision of the heart. Romans 2:25-29 says, "For indeed circumcision is of value if you practice the law, but if you are a transgressor of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. If therefore the uncircumcised man keeps requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? And will not he who is physically uncircumcised, if he keeps the law, will he not judge you as though having the letter of the law and circumcision are a transgressor of the law? For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, neither is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit, but not by the letter, and his praise is not from men, but from God." And so what's Paul talking about here in Romans 2, verse 25, where it says, "For indeed circumcision is of value if you practice the law, but if you are a transgressor of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision." So we see that in Romans 2 and verse 17, this is the context of the passage. He's talking to Jewish people. He's talking to a Jewish audience here. He's not talking to Gentiles. And so this is a reference to a Jew. And so another way to interpret this, or another way to say what he's saying here, is like this. He's telling the Jewish person, if you boast in being a Jew, but are not obedient like you're supposed to be, then what have you done in regard to the purpose of your chosenness? What have you done in regard to your being born a Jew? Because being a Jew is not just a physical lineage thing. Being a Jew is also being obedient to God and following his covenant. Here Paul is saying that the true Jew is one who has both a physical and spiritual connection to Abraham. We should be careful not to interpret this passage as saying that anyone who has faith has become a Jew, but that's another lesson. And so again, we're not saying that when you put faith in Yeshua that you become a Jew. That is not the point, and that is not the goal, because we know that from the beginning God intended for both Jew and Gentile to be part of his family. And this is that initial promise that he gave to Abraham, that in Abraham all of the families of the earth would be blessed. So Paul lets us know clearly that God's chosen people have both a physical and spiritual connection to himself. Another passage in Paul that has often been misunderstood but speaks to this issue is Galatians 6, verses 12 through 16. This is at the end of the epistle to the Galatians, and this is how Paul sums up the epistle. Those who desire to make a good showing in the flesh try to compel you to be circumcised, simply that they may not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. Those who are circumcised do not even keep the law themselves, but they desire to have you circumcised, that they may boast in your flesh. But may it never be that I should boast, except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, through which the world has been crucified to me and I to the world. For neither circumcision For neither is circumcision anything nor uncircumcision, but a new creation. And those who will walk by this rule, peace and mercy be upon them and upon the Israel of God. This comment here, or this phrase, the Israel of God, is thought to be a reference to the Christian church. And this is what the Christian church will say when he says the Israel of God. He's talking about the Christian church. This is, again, a replacement theology kind of teaching. But the reality is, at this particular point, there was no Christian church. There was no Sunday-keeping church. It was all sects of Judaism. And so to say that this is a reference to the Christian church is kind of silly, because it's not even there. But the idea of this passage, for neither is circumcision anything or uncircumcision. So what does this mean? This is saying, Paul is saying, being Jewish or not being Jewish means nothing in terms of your right standing with God. It means nothing to your righteousness. The only thing that's important is being a new creation. So the only thing that's important is being in Messiah. Whether you're circumcised or not, whether you're Jewish or not, it has no relevance. The only important thing is our connection through Messiah. And so evidently the influencers in Galatia, the ones that were teaching that Jewish status was of utmost importance, they were saying that you couldn't get the blessings from God because you had to be Jewish. And therefore the Gentiles had to convert. But Paul refutes that and says, no, being Jewish means nothing, being non-Jewish means nothing, be in Messiah. That's his point. Let's continue on, middle of page 15. Here Paul is dealing with those who are teaching the Gentile believers that unless they go through a rabbinic conversion, they really do not have a proper place in the body of Messiah. Of course, Paul considers this another gospel, a false gospel. One cannot gain a righteous status with God by going through a man-made ritual by which the society will grant the status of Jew. Rather, what Paul teaches is a need for becoming a new creation through faith in Yeshua. But when he ends this epistle, he gives a blessing upon those who will receive his halakha, who will walk by this rule. Remember, that's what the word halak, to walk, the halakha, the way that we walk, that's what this means. And so Paul this is a Jewish phrase when he says those who will walk by this rule. In other words, those who will follow the Torah, they follow the halakha. Then he includes the Israel of God. Some have suggested he is teaching that the church is now the Israel of God. This is, of course, impossible for a number of reasons, not the least of which that the church had not yet come into being, at least the church as we know it today. But it is more likely that Paul, by using the phrase Israel of God, is referring to the remnant of Israel, those who are true believers, and he includes in this Israel of God all those Jews who have been divinely chosen to receive and exercise faith in Messiah. He does not distinguish them as a separate entity from the Gentile believers, but he envisions them as a group who, though now rejecting Yeshua, will in fact receive him as Messiah through the witness of the believers and the outpouring of the Ruach in the last days. So again, this is not a replacement of Israel, but actually it's an enlargement of Israel. It's talking about the Israel of God, or all those who believe in Yeshua, all those who believe in God. And also this is a picture that Paul is alluding to, something that he says in Romans 11 verses 25 and 26, where he says all of Israel will be saved. And so this is Paul looking forward to a time when all of Israel will one day believe and accept Yeshua as Messiah, and it'll be Jew and Gentile together. And it'll be this will happen as those of us who are Gentiles, who are grafted in Romans 11. It says that we would move the Jews to jealousy. We would move the non-believing Jews to jealousy, that they would accept Yeshua as Messiah. And so let's continue on, bottom page 15. The point for our discussion here, however, is simply that once again, Paul has combined physical lineage with spiritual life. A Jew in Paul's way of thinking is someone in whom these two aspects are combined. But having said this, I want to quickly correct what I think could be a misunderstanding. I don't mean by this that those Jews who have rejected Yeshua are not truly Jews. This, of course, is what fueled the anti-Semitism of the early Christian church and continues to fuel it even in our day. Indeed, the Nazi SS were theologically trained to believe that they were doing God a favor by getting rid of the imposter Jews. So again, like I mentioned before, this is we don't want to have this understanding that the Jews who don't believe in Yeshua, even though it says in Romans 11 that they are the broken off branches, it doesn't mean that God still does not consider them his chosen people. It doesn't mean that God has done away with the Jewish people, that he has now rejected them. Consider the golden calf event. When that happened, they were still God's people. Yes, he punished them, he chastised them, but they were still his people. Even with the 10 spies, he put them in the wilderness, but they were still his people, and he went with them through the wilderness, through all of their trials and suffering. And even in the times when they were exiled from Israel, from the land, they were still God's people. They were still his chosen people. And so even today, even though they have rejected Messiah, they are still God's chosen people. Even though they have rejected Messiah, he is still remaining faithful to his covenant, and he is watching over his people. And the thing for us to remember is that we don't know God's timetable. We don't know God's timeline. Someone who rejects Yeshua today may accept him tomorrow. And I think this is Paul's point, that if these branches are broken off, they can also be grafted back in. There is no indication that the belief of the Jewish people is forever. God's the one that put the blinders over their eyes. He's the one that's going to remove them. And so we still have to be praying for our there are brothers in the covenant. And so we should still be praying for the Jewish people. So let's continue on top of page 16. No, the Israel of God consists of all those Jews in every generation who by God's own sovereign grace are drawn to him through his own mysterious ways. We cannot read the heart of any individual, and we cannot therefore judge who will come to faith and who will not. For this reason, Paul refers to those of his fellow Jews who had rejected Yeshua in his time in this way. Romans 11 and verse 28. From the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. And so the current unbelief of the Jews of his time, again, Paul's talking about the Jews of his time. The current unbelief of the Jews of his time did not cut them off from God. God still, according to Paul, through divine inspiration, Paul writes that they are still, from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. So even the non-believing Jews in the time of Paul, they were still precious in God's sight. They were still his chosen people. So if it's the same in the time of Paul, in the first century, in the time of after Yeshua's death, resurrection, and ascension, if God still saw the Jewish people as beloved in his eyes, is that the same today? And yet, yes, it is. Yes, it is. So here's a working definition of a Jew. This is what Tim Hegg says in the middle of page 16. A Jew is someone who has physical lineage with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. National Israel is that political entity made up of Jews. In God's eyes, those Jews who are pursuing him comprise the true Israel. Having a definition of what it means by the term Jew, it is important to emphasize that being Jewish in no way gives a person a higher standing or more prestige in the family of God. In fact, from one point of view, the Jewish nation was chosen to be God's servant to bring in the nations. Think of it this way. Israel is God's butler to serve his truth to the nations. In the end, Jew and Gentile are part of God's family as brother and sister, all on the same level and all with the same access to the Father. This is what Paul means when he says in Galatians 3 and verse 28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free man, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Messiah Yeshua. So again, the point of this particular passage is God loves us all the same. He's not going to love one better than the other. I had one individual show me this passage and say, you see, because it says there's neither Jew nor Greek, so that means we're neither Jew nor Greek, and so there's no Jew or Greek in existence today, so we cannot say someone is Jewish and someone is Gentile today, because that's what the Scripture says. And so what I challenged this individual on, I said, well, let's keep reading. it says there's neither male or female. I'm sorry, there are male and there are female today. So if there are males and females today, then there are Jews and there are Gentiles today. So that's a wrong perspective on that particular passage. So as we continue to love and appreciate and walk out the Torah, we will come closer and closer in alignment with the culture of the Jewish people. We will become closer and closer in alignment with the worship that takes place in the synagogue. They are the only group of people, again, they are the only group of people who have been walking in Torah from generation to generation for millennia, for several millennia. And so why not look to our older brother? Why not look to the Jewish people and see how they understand the Torah, how they worship our God, and why can't we? In fact, we should be looking to them to gain some understanding of the Torah. And again, they don't have all the answers, just like the Christian church doesn't have all the answers. Well, where the Christian church has denied the feast days and the Torah and a lot of the traditions, the Jewish sages have also adopted mysticism. They've denied Messiah. They've denied Yeshua. And so there's baggage on both sides. But we have to have discernment as we go through studying the traditions and studying the sages, and even as we go through Christian commentaries as well and listen to Christian teachings. We have to be discerning and be able to pick out those gold nuggets that we can apply to our lives, those principles and things that we can learn and apply to our worship of our God. But the thing that we need to remember as we look to the Jewish community and as we glean traditions from them, we have to understand that our identity is first and foremost in Yeshua. Our identity is first and foremost in Messiah. Jewishness and non-Jewishness does not matter. It doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter to us. I don't think anyone here at Front Range have I ever asked if they were Jewish or non-Jewish, because I really don't care. If you are, celebrate it. If you're not, celebrate that. But the point is, are you in Messiah? That's what I want to know. Are you in Messiah? And that's what we all should be eager to know. Are you a brother in Messiah? And then let's welcome each other in. So that concludes our lesson. I know it's a lot of information. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please come and talk to me. And we'll continue this conversation about who is a Jew and what is our responsibility as a non-Jew, and what can we do, what shouldn't we do, and those types of things. If you want a better understanding of our being grafted into Israel, there's a great book by Tim Hegg. It's called Fellow Heirs. You can find it on their website, TorahResource.com, and there's a store that you can log into and purchase the book. It's a short read, but it's chock-filled with information about what it means for us to be grafted into Israel as non-Jewish believers. And what you'll find is that we have the same responsibility to follow the Torah. And in the first century, when we have the first century church even with Gentiles as part of the sect of the Nazarene, the followers of the way, the followers of Yeshua, they looked just like the non-believing Jews in their practice. And so that's our understanding, and that's what we're trying to return to, a first century form of worship, a first century way of worshiping our Messiah. So I hope you've enjoyed this class, and next week I'm not exactly sure what we're going to talk about, so that'll be a surprise, but looking forward to meeting with you then. Have a good week. The goal of this series of lessons is to present a brief overview of the beliefs and practices that characterize a Messianic Jewish congregation. More specifically, how these traditions are viewed and kept at the Front Range Messianic Community. For more information, please visit frontrangemessianic.com.